Well, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening. It's getting close to that time. Before I start, I will introduce myself very quickly. Yat she Shelly Lowe Yinashia, Belagana Nishlin, Anastasia Tachini Bashichi, Belagana Dashache, do Trabaha Dashanale, Lo Krantil, the Nasha, do Washington, Dishigan. My name is Shelly Lowe. I'm Navajo. I grew up on the Navajo Reservation in Ganado, Arizona, and I now live and work in Washington, D.C. But I spent 2 years here in New Haven working for Yale, my first time living outside of Arizona ever in my life. It was an adjustment. It was kind of a shock. I had never seen so much water before, and every time I saw it, I was like, "Look, there's more water. Look, there's some more water." And it was very green until it was dark. Somehow, at the end of November, I'd be riding my bike home at 3:30 in the afternoon, and it was pitch black. That was rough, but it's lovely to be here, to have been away for a little while, to come back and to see growth and to see how some things have really shifted and changed, particularly in terms of storytelling, because I think we've had some really great visits both today and yesterday in ways that, for some individuals who have come through the university or who have lived here, these are amazing stories that we didn't have told, that we weren't able to go and see. And now you can walk in and you can learn a little bit more about this location and the history of this location, but through stories that weren't being told. And that's been very exciting. That's been very, very exciting.
Here, can you talk a little bit about your path from Yale to where you are now? What does that look like?
Sure. So I grew up on Navajo Reservation and I graduated high school and went to the University of Arizona. So I worked in public universities for about 15 years. I was also a student, of course. And I came to Yale. I got the interview to come to Yale after I finished my doctoral coursework. So, at that time they say you can't get your PhD in the same institution that you want to work at. You've got to go someplace else. Well, I went someplace else, very, very far away. But I got the interview, called to do the interview, and I got off the phone and I was like, okay, I get to go check out this, job prospect. And where's New Haven? I don't know where that is. And I had to look it up. It's, I spent all of my profession in higher education, really working with Native students and working on Native affairs in higher education, kind of across the board with students, faculty, administration. And I was very interested in trying to make sure that Native students knew about college opportunities, that they could come into universities, that they could be supportive, that they could be successful. Because I was told when I went to college that I only got in because I was Native. I only got the scholarship that I got because I was Native, that I was going to fail because all Native students fail. You're never going to graduate. You're just going to go home and you're going to be poor, right? And you're going to live on the res. And I didn't want students to be coming to universities, particularly a university like Yale, right? To kind of hear those things said to them. I wanted them to feel like they could be here, they could thrive, they could really take on this identity as a college student and be proud. I came into some institutions with alumni who were very angry at their experience in the institution, as Native students in particular, and trying to, they were here and they were telling me it needs to be better. This has to be a better place for Native students. So I spent a lot of time really focusing on how do we make higher education better for Native students. And I was in my office at Harvard and I got a phone call. That's when we actually had phones on our desks. Doesn't happen anymore. We all have phones in our hands. But a very young woman said, "Is this Shelly Lowe?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And she said, "President Obama has looked at your resume and wants to know if you would be interested in serving on the National Council for the Humanities." And I was like, what? As if President Obama has ever looked at my resume. And then she said, "Would you be interested?" And I was like, what? Then she said, "Well, I just need to confirm who you are. Can you give me your social security number?" And I said, "No." And poor thing. She was, a young White House staffer and she just came about it all wrong. And I said, "Can you give me some information, your contact information? Let me call you back." And I walked out of my office and I looked at some of my colleagues and I said, "I just got this weird phone call. Have you ever heard of this organization?" I had not, I had to look it up. What is National Endowment for Humanities? And then what happens when you do that? I had to look up, how do you define humanities? What does that mean? So I called her back, clearly. And we went through this long process. It takes a while when you get nominated and you have to go through Senate confirmation. There's a lot of stuff that you have to do. There's a lot of FBI background checks, and people call you. The FBI called me. They want to ask about you. Did you do something? Should I know something? And, I got onto the council, and I started, we review the applications that are recommended for funding. But we get to see all the applications that aren't recommended for funding. And in that work, I was I would go through every single page of the lists of applications, and I'd earmark the pages that had tribal colleges or tribal communities or really small organizations that I was familiar with who were always down the line, not recommended for funding, right? And I was always kind of like, why do I keep seeing this? Why aren't they being funded? And I would ask sometimes of the staff, and, it was, well, they didn't get a good review from the panel, and, there's all these reasons. And when they called me to see if I would interview for this position, and I said, what? Again. But when we went through the process and I came in, the question was, well, what's your vision for the agency? And I said, I didn't know I was supposed to have a vision for the agency, but I just want to fund those things that haven't been funded because I know that they're doing really great work. And I've heard organizations say, NEH doesn't fund small organizations. Why do you keep coming to talk to us? Why are you encouraging us to apply? You know that you're not going to take us seriously. And I said, I just want to fund those people and figure out how we can maybe open up opportunities to be able to be more equitable in the work that we do. That's how I got here. A lot of what?
Love that. In your role, thinking about that, in your role as the chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities, you visited many of the nation's states and territories. Can you reflect on your experiences, what you've seen in the field, that illustrates some of the most pressing issues and how humanities are being used to address them?
So I have to say, if any of you ever have the opportunity to do this job, totally do it. I've seen so many amazing places, communities, organizations. I have learned so many things about this country that I never knew before. And every time I kind of go into a community and I learn a new story, staff often come with me. I want to acknowledge Brianne, who's over here with me, a staffer. She's the director of our Preservation and Access Division. So talk to her at the reception. It's just, we're constantly asking, why didn't we know this? Why didn't I know this history? And when I came into the position, I had to say, because I've seen all the applications, I've seen the work that people are doing in the humanities or proposing to do. And I said, we are such a great country, because I've seen so many things that people are trying to do to tell our history and to tell our story of this country. And it's so beautiful. But at the same time, a lot of what I see and a lot of what I hear are the really, the difficult stories, the traumatizing stories sometimes that, you walk through an exhibit and you just kind of want to cry. Or you hear about people who have walked through the exhibit and have had to stop and then cry, right? Because these are very difficult stories to tell. But I think that what I have seen is, one, there are a lot of hidden histories, and we've heard that over the past 2 days here about things that we didn't know, right? Things that I didn't know. And I always go back to a class that I took, a doctoral class, with a faculty member, very, prestigious. She was a prestigious faculty member in education. She was teaching the race, class, and gender course for higher education. And of course, there was like the one class where we did Native history, right? And she came in and she said from the get-go, she had assigned a book about boarding schools for us to read. And she said, I never knew this history. She assigned the book. And I sat there and I thought, why am I in this class? If you don't know this history and you've got a PhD in education and you're supposed to have the knowledge, you're supposed to teach me, why am I in this class? I don't understand. And then you have to kind of step back at that point, right? And you have to think, well, she was never taught this. None of us were taught this. And those are kind of those hidden histories about our country that I see as really big challenges, right? We're trying to tell these stories, and there's a lot of pushback in trying to tell these stories. But there's so much that we can do with the humanities to bring these stories forward because they are part of our history, because they are part of the people who make up this country. And they are telling these stories as our way to not just strengthen individuals and communities, but to strengthen the country together, right? Having that understanding and really being able to deal with it in difficult ways. I think the other things that I have seen that humanities and councils have really been working to do, and we fund 56 state and jurisdictional councils. So Connecticut Humanities is one of the councils. Um, I was recently in Hawaii for FestPac and for a visit with our council. And a lot of the work in Hawaii is focused on like aloha aina, right? The love of the land and returning the land, caring for the land. And I see a lot of intersection between what we do in humanities and how we have to care for our environment. And there are a lot of people who say, well, how does humanities really interplay with environment and climate and all of these things? And, in Hawaii, it's if you don't take care of the land, it's not going to take care of you in the future, right? And what are we going to do when we don't have that land for the future and the ability to take care of ourselves as human beings? And there's a real strong focus in ensuring that what everybody is learning kind of in Hawaii, on the islands, is how to care for that land and how to make sure that we move some of these things forward. But I've also seen that, there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of how do we strengthen our democracy? Because democracy is really built on the foundation of humanities, right? It's humanities teaching, it's humanities skills, understandings, tools that we use to keep our democracy strong. And I've seen communities across the United States say, we have to do this. We have to do this now. We have to improve literacy. We have to improve civics education. We have to improve the teaching of history. We have to be stronger and more vocal about what humanities is and why it is so important to us as a community and as a nation. And how do we continue to move that forward? And these are continuing conversations that every single council, every single community is talking about.
So going from the national lens to visiting Connecticut. During our time together over the past 2 days, we've taken a bit of a whirlwind trip around Connecticut to visit some of the cultural sites and meeting with people doing humanities work. What have you seen during your time here that aligns with your broader NEH initiatives and specifically in connection to American Tapestry?
So for those of you who are not familiar with American Tapestry, when I came into the chair's position, the Biden-Harris administration had already been in place for a year. And I came in with the kind of conversation of these are the priorities for the Biden-Harris administration. Do they align with what you want to bring and what you want to lead with the agency? And I said, oh, yes, absolutely. Thank you. So American Tapestry was created with conversations with our staff and our program directors who, have been extremely knowledgeable in the field, who are paying attention to what's going on, who have been really thinking about what does humanities need, not just from the agency, but, just in general for support. And through these conversations, American Tapestry, our initiative was created. And it's American Tapestry weaving together past, present, and future. And we have three main pillars that we want to focus on with American Tapestry. One is strengthening our democracy. The second is equity for all. And the third is addressing our changing climate. And much of this, comes out of thinking about the applications that we have been getting over the years, kind of new applications and new areas that people were trying to do work in, but also the ways that the staff had really been able to say, here's where we haven't been really doing a lot of work, but here's where our work and our funding can really support projects and can really move this forward. So we've created a few new grant lines to meet these three pillars. And part of it, especially the equity for all, is one of the conversations we had last night. And I'm going to turn to you in a minute, back to you with a question, but was kind of saying, goes back to the hidden histories, but also goes back to we don't have that knowledge base, those documents, that archive available for us to answer that question. And last night there was a wonderful, wonderful tale or story kind of about the history, but about the material that is available. You just had to look for it in the right way. And people weren't looking at this material to find the history of African Americans in the state in the ways that, people were saying, well, that's not there. We don't have that kind of information. It's not in the archives. And she said, yes, it is. So we had a dinner last night with the Sites of Consciousness locations that you had supported. I don't know if you want to then tell them some of those sites and what the work was.
Sure. So Connecticut Humanities several years ago created a partnership with the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. And in doing so, we really wanted to sort of look at a series of people, communities, organizations that have had impactful histories, not just in the past, but how those still resonate today. And so we identified a fairly long list, but ended up focusing on 5 organizations in the state of Connecticut to pilot the Connecticut Sites of Conscience. And the first was the Freeman Houses in the historic Black community of Little Liberia in Bridgeport, the Pequot Hill area of Mystic, where the Pequot Massacre took place in the 1630s, the Prudence Crandall Museum, and soon to be the Prudence Crandall Sarah Harris Museum, which was known as a school for little colored misses, thinking about education equity. Old Newgate Prison, which was the site of the first prison in the United States, in East Granby, Connecticut, which is a former copper mine, and now a place that is interpreted through the lens of our carceral policies. And then the Old State House, which is a site for so many things around our legal and political and social history, not the least of which was involving the Amistad incident and the enslaved people in the 1830s. So we convened these 5 organizations to think about how they can sort of build a community of practice around key issues of economic, social, racial, environmental justice. And so we had a really robust conversation last night around some of those stories that involve communities that have not had their stories traditionally told. And in doing so, Maisa Tisdale, who directs the Freeman Houses, is just a remarkable person, remarkable leader, and was telling the story of some of the work that her staff has been doing and looking at the people in the community and just the intersections with these larger national narratives, from an intersection with the Emperor of Haiti to Frederick Douglass, and so on. And so these are remarkable histories, and the more you sort of just scratch under the archival surface, the more you find and the more you connect. So it's just an amazing story.
Yeah. And so, I think for me, that ties into American Tapestry because, a lot of these stories do weave together. And we haven't known that before because we haven't been asking the right questions or looking for the right keywords when we're looking at the archives, when we're looking at the material. And, the big focus last night was that there's all these great stories in these archives and we're finding all of this information. And, they were kind of giddy, like, what are we going to find today? What's going to happen? What kind of good story can we tell today? And part of American Tapestry is really bringing that forward and helping us to have those stories and that history.
And this is something that happened over the course of just 3 months. So imagine with a little more time and investment, what more remarkable stories can emerge. You are the first Native person to chair NEH. What a remarkable moment in our history and a signal to the future Indigenous people. Could you talk a little bit more about how your Dene or Navajo orientation has informed and or reshaped your agency's work?
Maybe I'll talk about how it's informed me. I don't know that we've reshaped.
Longer process.
Maybe. We'll see. I grew up on Navajo reservation, and it's very rural. It's pretty poor, and I grew up surrounded by Navajo culture, Navajo language. it's just kind of part of the environment that I was in. It was something that I was being introduced to every single day in kind of everything in school, in church when I went on Sundays, with family, conversations. And then I went to the University of Arizona, which is a very non-Navajo environment. And it was a little bit shocking for me. It's kind of like going from Arizona to Connecticut. It's like so different. What happened? I don't understand. And that's how you start to realize for the first time that non-Navajo people are really not Navajo in the way that they kind of, think sometimes, and some of their values, the way that they kind of come about their mannerisms, how they talk. And that for me was kind of like, okay, I have to figure out, that there's this difference, there's this diversity I hadn't really been introduced to before. What does that mean? And throughout my undergraduate career, I had the opportunity to travel with my mentor. She was an American Indian Studies faculty member. She was on various national boards, and I was able to travel with her, go to these meetings and these conferences. And I was introduced to Indian country, right? The tribes across the United States. And they are very not Navajo too, right? But they're tribal people, and they had different customs and cultures and values. And the way that, even though some things were very similar, a lot of the things that they did were very different from the way Navajos did it. And I was just so kind of like, wow, this is amazing. I didn't know any of this because I was very, specific to growing up in Navajo culture. But one of the more beautiful things about it was I didn't want to be Sioux. I didn't want to be Mashpee, right? I was taught to be Navajo, and I wanted to be Navajo, and I didn't want them to be Navajo, right? And it was okay to say, I'm learning about your culture, and I think it's beautiful, and I love the values that you have in certain ways, but I don't need to be you, and you don't need to be me. But we can have absolute respect for one another, and we can learn from one another, and we can share, and we can come together. And I think that that's one of the things that I try to bring into the work, is that it's not about conformity. It's not about us all being one person. It's about telling those diverse stories. It's about honoring those diverse cultures. And it's about saying, I really respect that. And I gravitate to this teaching that you have in your culture, which I may, make use of, but I'm going to be Navajo, and I got to stay Navajo, and I'm going to do it the way that I need to do it, because that's how I was taught. And that's what it means, for me to be this person. And I say to a lot of people, when I try to define humanities, and everybody in here needs to define humanities in an easy way for the public to understand, and then give me that definition so I can use it. It's, for me, it's our creation stories. I've learned creation stories from other tribes, and it's our values. It's how we are taught to be individuals, how we have family values, how we relate to the environment, how we even relate to other people who are not part of our culture. And if we don't have these creation stories, these values that make us who we are not going to be that person anymore. We'll be somebody else. It'll be a different story. So kind of learning that and understanding that. So, when we read, or I look at the applications, everybody's telling a creation story of some sort, or relying on a creation story that they know to do this project and to move something forward. And I find that to be so amazing. It's fascinating what people are doing out there. Sometimes I have no idea what they're talking about, but it's amazing all of the humanities projects and work that people are doing out in this country, and how many, and I keep coming back to how much I don't know that I have not been introduced to yet. That I hope one day I have the opportunity to be introduced to, but more importantly, I hope one day we all have the opportunity to be introduced to this, this knowledge, this new way of understanding what the history is, these stories. Some of them are really, really funny, happy stories. Some of them are not so funny, happy stories, but it informs me in ways that help me to see a much larger, very beautiful picture of our country and who we are as American people. And I try to think about that as always trying to see the world in beauty. And how do we do that? How do we use humanities, the skills that we have, the tools that we have, to ensure that we see beauty before us, so that we walk in beauty, right? That we're always doing what we do with that beauty in mind and moving that forward.
Thank you. The founding legislation of the National Endowment for the Humanities and National Endowment for the Arts highlights the importance of funding arts and humanities as a counterpoint to the hyperinvestment in science at the time. We know that when states in our nation invest in the humanities, communities thrive. And spending time here in Connecticut and learning about the Connecticut Cultural Fund and our investments in meaningful, reliable, and equitable funding, are there insights you can offer to elected leaders across the state on maintaining such investments for the common good?
It'll be reflections. I can offer reflections. I'm going to go back to what you said. Funding humanities helps communities thrive. So I ask audiences fairly often, please, define humanities for me. And one gentleman, said, humanities is health. And I said, yes, but, let's break that down. Humanities really is about health. It's about healthy communities. It's about healthy democracy. It's about healthy civic engagement. It's about having a healthy understanding of our own history and who we are and how we got to be here. And then it's having a healthy outlook for the future, right? So how do we ensure that we can be investing in health for the future? Well, it does come back to investing in humanities. It comes back to investing in literacy, ensuring that individuals are able to understand all of our history, understand all of the materials that we have, understand how to find answers to things. I think it's also about how do we invest in the future so that we can solve problems, right? So one of the things, a lot of people ask, well, what does NEH do? And I've been trying to figure out how to say this in a way that people, just everyday people, everybody can understand. And I sometimes will say, well, we're getting ready to commemorate 250 years of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But what NEH does is ensure that in 250 years in the future, when you have a question about what happened or what's going on, or you just, you have a question about your community, we are ensuring that you have the material there to answer that question, right? It's about being able to answer the questions that you have and making sure that cultural heritage is there, making sure those archives are there, making sure that we have uncovered that information so that it is accessible to you to answer those questions. And that goes back to problem solving, right? Being able to then have the material, have the knowledge, have the understanding, but then have the ability to talk to each other, have the ability to talk between communities, between states, and share that information with one another so that things can be solved when there are issues that arise, that we can come together and we can say, we know how to do this. Guess what? We use the tools of the humanities and we can solve all of the problems that we're having, right? No matter what they are. It really is about investing in the future and investing in a healthy democracy, healthy communities, and healthy environments, right? Because we have to also ensure that we have environments for everybody to be able to do all of this great humanities work that we will be doing in the future.
Thank you. I love this framing of health. Yeah. It's wonderful. You teed me up for the 250th. In just over 2 years, actually just over 2 years, the United States will be commemorating the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. For some, this is a moment to celebrate. For others who don't see themselves reflected in the nation's founding documents, truth, reckoning, and repair are necessary. For all of us here and now, how can humanities bring us together to forge a more just and equitable future?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing at NEH. So I told you when I came in, the Biden-Harris administration had already been in for a year. But I had spent 6 years, right, on the council. So I was familiar with the organization and what we were doing, kind of how we were structured. I didn't have as much of the administrative side understanding as I did the program side, the grant funding part that we do. But when I came in, as federal agencies, we all had to do an equity action plan. And part of our equity action plan was to decide and figure out how the agency could really address this equity for all issue, right? How do we ensure that when we do go into celebrating or commemorating the 250th, that we can do it in equitable ways and ensure that what NEH is doing in our reach is really reaching everybody. So we did, not immediately, but we created an Office of Data and Evaluation first. So NEH had not had an Office of Data and Evaluation for a few years. And so those of you who come out of higher education, right, there's always an institutional research office, right? Because you have to do reports all the time. You have to submit data all the time. You have to inform your congressional leaders about the work that you're doing. You have to give numbers, all the way, numbers all the time. But we didn't have that. We have a lot of data, and it's in a lot of different forms. But when I came in asking, who are we funding? Can I get a really good sense based on years of funding? Who are we funding? But then asking, who are we not funding? That was information that we couldn't easily and readily answer. But our Office of Data and Evaluation is now created so that we can start to answer those questions, right? We can look at our own work and say, here's where our funding has gone. You asked about kind of Connecticut and how much has gone into Connecticut, right? We can start to look by state, we can start to look by regions, but we can also start to say, where are the big gaps in where our funding has been going? Where are the institutions, the communities, the organizations that, either have not been applying because they just don't see NEH as a place that funds them, or they don't have an understanding of NEH and what we do? How do we ensure that we have a good picture for what we do and the impacts we can make? Because then we want to tell that impact story. The second thing we did was we created an Office of Outreach. So it's one thing to sit and say, oh, everybody's going to come to NEH and apply for money because we have money, right? And lots of people do, but lots of people don't know, and we want them to know, right? We want to say that the NEH funding is there for all Americans, for programs that you are doing in the smallest communities in the United States to the largest institutions that reach millions and millions of people and audiences. But how do we ensure that everybody is aware of that? We often take for granted that everybody knows what we do and that they're coming to us and they're seeking funding. But we know that that's not the case. And so we're trying to ensure that we can be out there. We can make sure that we're telling our story in the right way so people know. And hopefully, then it comes back to telling the story of our impact and telling Congress and telling elected leaders, this is the impact that humanities is having in your state and in your communities. And this is kind of the what we've seen from that impact over the years. And we're going to work with our state councils to ensure that they're helping us to tell this story, right? And they can say, here's what we're doing, here's how we're doing it. And when it comes back to then commemorating the 250th, it's that ensuring that everybody feels like they are a part of it, or they can be a part of it, right? And that we are there to support them in the work and the stories that they need to do, especially if they feel like they haven't been a part of that before.
Wonderful. So here we are in New Haven, the coastal city on the periphery of Long Island Sound. Yesterday, we were in Mystic, on the other end of the Sound, and on Mystic Seaport's campus that now floods more than 24 times a year and counting. Indeed, many of the communities and cultural organizations are in coastal and riverine flood zones. And not to sound dire, but hurricanes and tornadoes are not uncommon. We know climate change is happening. Can you talk a little bit about how NEH is addressing climate change and thinking about climate resilience?
Yes. So one of the pillars, under American Tapestry is how do we use humanities to look at our changing climate? A lot of this work started prior to me, of course, with previous chairs. There would be a disaster, hurricanes, lots of flooding. We can look to New Orleans. We can look to Louisiana, and institutions that were saying, we have almost lost everything, all of our archives, all of our collection. What do we do? How do we get some help? And one of the things that NEH has are CHAIRS grants, and these are small grants that organizations can apply to. And we started to see a lot more CHAIRS grant applications come in from organizations who had suffered some kind of environmental catastrophe, whether it was floods, whether it was damaging storms, whether it was tornadoes. And how do we get some support to do this? FEMA can take a very long time. We know that. We see this in Puerto Rico, but our funding can come a little bit quicker. And it's not a lot of funding, right? But it was a way to say to cultural organizations, here's some funds to help you dry out your collection that's all wet, or to bring some people in to help you at least try to save as much of your collection as possible. I mean, they all have, when you apply to NEH, it's your project. It's what's your need. It's what you need to have done. So we're not telling people this is what you need to do. But we figured out that these were coming more and more and more often, right? And that we were seeing a lot more need in these areas of really helping cultural organizations, humanities organizations to really repair and to come back after these climate issues and these climate experiences that they've been having. So, of course, I will turn to the staff again because they have been thinking about this. They're seeing the applications. They're talking to organizations. They, really felt that there has to be a way that we can do this on a regular basis so that it's not just ad hoc when things happen. But we can do this in two ways. We can do this either through mitigating, trying to mitigate what the effects of some severe storms and severe climate issues might have and bring to your institution, your organization, or adaptation, right? How do we adapt ourselves to ensure that we can be prepared for what might be coming? So we created 2 new grant programs, and I'm gonna just point out Brianne again because she oversees one of them. And Brianne does Cultural and Community Resilience Program under our Preservation and Access. And it's really about safeguarding cultural resources and cultural heritage and ensuring that the knowledge that comes out of those resources, which sometimes is stories from individual people, can be maintained and will not be lost when severe weather incidences happen. And how do communities do that? Some of this did start with COVID-19. How do we ensure that we capture the knowledge of individuals, especially communities who were very hard hit by COVID-19 and lost a lot of members, a lot of community knowledge, family knowledge? How do we ensure that we start to capture that and save it and make sure it's there for the future? The second is our Climate Smart Humanities Organizations grant through our Office of Challenge Programs. And this is really to allow institutions to create climate action plans for their institutions and for their organizations. And we've seen individual organizations come and do this for their institutions in particular. And then we've seen collective groups come and say, we want to do this as small organizations together, and we can all use the same plan. So it's paying for individuals to come in for consultants, so that they can create plans and really start to think about what do we need to do in the next 2 years, in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years to really be prepared. And I said yesterday at the Seaport Museum that, Jamestown is one of the sites that we have funded. And they're trying to figure out how to mitigate, the rising sea levels and what are they going to do? It's an archaeological site. And it could be underwater very soon. What are they going to do? So they've got a Climate Smart grant to help them prepare and think about what's going to happen. But, I told you I was in Hawaii, and I was in Lahaina. I was there right where, all the fires had come through. And that wasn't the only fire on Maui. And, our funding is coming in to repair, things that were lost at Lahaina that were just gone, right? And how do we start to rebuild some of the knowledge that was lost there? How do we start to create spaces for communities to come back together as humanities, communities with humanities projects after, something devastating like that happens? So we're being very thoughtful about how we do this work.
And we are incredibly grateful for that. What are your dreams for the future? And how can humanities deliver us there?
My dreams for the future is that NEH will be fully and well-funded in perpetuity, right? This forever. And we can do all of this great work and really fund all of these small organizations and really meet everybody where they are and strengthen humanities and democracy. And everybody has that dream here, right? I think one of my dreams is that, one, we will find a definition for humanities that everybody understands and share that story, right? That everybody knows this is what humanities is, this is why humanities is important, and this is the role it plays in my life. I think that we all have that sense if we really stop and really think about it, because you just think about, how did you grow up? What did your community look like? What were the values that you were taught? That is humanities, right? And that is a part of every single one of our lives. But having that importance front and center is where I would like to see us go, through our funding, through legislation, through our elected officials, but through how we plan out all the work that we do. How do we plan out education? How do we plan out even how cities are organized, and how we set up new buildings, and how we think about where parks go, right? That we use humanities as kind of the forefront of what we do before we even, sit down. Like, this is it. We'll use our humanities tools first, and then we'll go about the work. Because I tell people fairly often, the beauty of humanities, right, is it allows you to just stop and pause sometimes. And sometimes we need to stop and pause and just reflect. And sometimes we have the ability to do that without even thinking, right? Reading a really good book and you just get so absorbed in it, or watching this fabulous documentary that you're going to text 10 of your best friends about and say, you have to watch this one. And it allows us to then say, oh, and after we pause and reflect, right, I think humanities gives us the strength to continue forward then after that, especially when things are difficult, especially when we're trying to figure out how do we move forward when we see so much that's just really is scaring us, makes us nervous, we just, keeps us up at night. That to me is, being able to say to people, humanities is going to allow me to move this forward, is going to give me the strength and the courage, right? I think humanities gives us courage. We can see it, we can read it, somebody else did it, we can watch how it was done. Then I can say, yeah, I can do that too, or I can tell my story. He or she told his story and it was really difficult. Gives us the courage to move forward. And I think that I'd like to just, everybody has creation story. We're all just going to live and move our creation stories forward. You're going to help me.
We are at the ready. And Shelly Lowe, thank you very much for the reminder to pause and reflect. Thank you for your vision. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you.